Patience is one of the virtues we hear about often, but it is also one of the hardest to practice. In today's world, where we have so many things at our fingertips, we are taught to expect instant results. Whether it's through technology, social media, or even our daily lives, we are conditioned to expect things quickly. But there is something deeply profound in understanding that good things take time. God is not in a hurry, and neither should we be. It's easy to get frustrated when things don't happen as quickly as we'd like. Perhaps you're waiting for a breakthrough in your career, praying for a change in your relationships, or seeking healing for something in your life. It's tempting to look around and compare our journey with others, wondering why things seem to move faster for them. But we need to remind ourselves that God's timing is always perfect, even when it feels like we're stuck or the waiting is unbearable. For years, he was stuck in circumstances that seemed to be the complete opposite of the dreams God had given him. Yet through all of this, Joseph remained faithful. He trusted God even when the journey was long, painful, and uncertain. And in the fullness of time, God's plan was revealed. Joseph became second in command in Egypt, saving nations, including his own family, from a severe famine. The dreams that God had given him were fulfilled, but not in Joseph's timing, in God's perfect timing. We can learn so much from Joseph's example. His story teaches us that good things take time, and while we may not always understand the process, we can trust the process. In moments of waiting, when it feels like nothing is happening, God is at work. He is shaping us, refining us, and preparing us for something greater than we can even imagine. Consider the gardener. A gardener plants a seed with great care, waters it and nurtures it, but the growth process takes time. The gardener doesn't expect to see a fully grown plant the next day. No, the gardener knows that there is a season for everything, and so it is with our lives. We may plant dreams, hopes, and desires, but we may be patient as God waters them, cultivates them, and brings them to fruition in His perfect time. We are often in a hurry to see results, but God's timing is different from ours. He is not bound by the clock. In fact, God is outside of time. What we perceive as delays are often divine appointments. What we consider as waiting periods may be opportunities for us to grow in ways that we would never have experienced if we had rushed through the process. One of the key lessons we learn from Scripture is that patience produces character. James 1:3-4 reminds us that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything. It's not the easy seasons that build our character. It's the difficult ones. The ones where we feel like we're waiting for something to happen and yet nothing seems to change. In those moments, God is doing something deep in our hearts. He's refining us, teaching us to trust Him, to lean on His wisdom, and to surrender our own plans for His greater purpose. And what is the ultimate result of this process? The Bible tells us in Romans 5:03-4 that we also glory in our sufferings, because we know that suffering produces perseverance, perseverance character, and character hope. Patience and perseverance lead to a stronger, deeper character, and ultimately to hope, a hope that does not disappoint, hope in God's promises, hope in His faithfulness, hope in His ability to bring good things into our lives at just the right moment. In those seasons when it feels like nothing is happening, we can remember that God is still working. He is at work behind the scenes, orchestrating things in a way that we can't see. Think about the time it takes to create a beautiful piece of art or to build a sturdy house. The work takes time, patience, and careful attention to detail. God is building something beautiful in your life, something that will stand the test of time, something that will bring glory to His name. We also need to remember that waiting on God doesn't mean being passive. Patience doesn't mean sitting idly by, doing nothing, and waiting for life to happen to us. No, patience in the biblical sense is an active trust in God. It's continuing to walk in faith, continuing to do the things He has called us to do, and trusting that He will bring about the right results in His time. In fact, some of the greatest lessons of patience are learned in the quiet moments of our lives, when it feels like nothing is happening. It's in those moments that God often does His most profound work in our hearts. We learn to lean on Him, to trust Him, even when we can't see the way forward. We learn that God is enough, even when everything around us seems uncertain. Patience also requires humility. We must humble ourselves before God and acknowledge that we are not in control. The world tells us that we can achieve anything we want if we work hard enough. But the truth is that we are limited. We can't control the timing of our lives or force things to happen on our own. The more we trust God with our future, the more we realize that He knows what's best for us. God's plan for your life is unfolding, even if you can't see the details right now. You may feel like you're in the waiting room of life, but I want you to know that God has not forgotten you. He sees you. He knows your heart. He knows the desire of delay. But God tells us that if we don't give up, if we continue to walk in faith, we will see the harvest at just the right time. When it comes to the things of God, timing is everything. Think about the story of Abraham and Sarah. God promised them a child, but for many years they waited. The years went by, and it seemed like the promise would never come to pass. They tried to take matters into their own hands, but in the end, God fulfilled His promise at the right time. Isaac was born, and God's plan was revealed in its fullness. It wasn't in their time, but in God's perfect time. So today, I encourage you to hold on to the promises of God, even in the midst of waiting. Don't give up. Don't lose heart. God is at work even when you can't see it. Trust Him in the process. Know that He is faithful to complete the good work He has begun in you. It's easy to look around and feel like others are moving ahead, achieving their dreams, and reaping the rewards. But remember, God's plan for you is unique. Your timing will be different from theirs, but that doesn't mean you're any less loved or valued. It simply means that your journey is unfolding in its own way, and when the time is right, you will see the fruit of your patience. As you wait, continue to grow, continue to trust, continue to take one step after another, and above all, remember that good things take time. God is working in you, and in His perfect timing, He will bring about His good plans for your life. So be patient, be faithful, and know that the best is yet to come. Good things take time, and God's timing is perfect. Even when we feel like we're waiting or stuck, God is working behind the scenes, orchestrating events for our good in His own perfect timing. Just as a gardener nurtures a seed over time, we must trust that God is cultivating something beautiful in our lives, even when we can't see the immediate results. Patience is part of the process, and it refines our character. Patience doesn't mean being passive. We must actively trust God, continue to walk in faith, and do the things He has called us to do while leaving the results to Him. The waiting seasons are opportunities for growth, and while it may feel like nothing is happening, God is preparing us for something greater. His plan for our lives is unfolding perfectly, even if we don't understand it right now. Patience in God's timing is one of the most profound aspects of the Christian walk. In a world that thrives on instant gratification and speed, the concept of waiting, especially when it feels like nothing is happening, can be difficult to embrace. We live in an age where technology has conditioned us to expect things quickly. Messages delivered in an instant, information at our fingertips, and answers to our questions with a few clicks. But when it comes to God's timing, the process is often slower than we'd like. It doesn't happen on our terms, nor does it unfold according to our timetable. And yet, the Bible makes it clear that God's timing is perfect, even when it doesn't match our expectations or our sense of urgency. Think about the many stories in Scripture where God's timing played a pivotal role in His unfolding plan. One of the most notable examples is the story of the Israelites' journey out of Egypt. The Israelites had been enslaved for over 400 years, and their suffering was great. They cried out to God for deliverance, but for generations it seemed as though their prayers went unanswered. It wasn't until God heard their cries in Exodus 2:24-25 that He responded. God heard their groaning, and He remembered His covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. Yet the deliverance did not come immediately. God's plan to free them from their bondage unfolded in His time, not according to their desperation. He raised up Moses, sent him back to Egypt, and performed miraculous signs and wonders before the final decisive act, the Passover and the crossing of the Red Sea. Imagine how the Israelites must have felt during those years of waiting. It's easy to assume that God had forgotten them or that He was slow to act, but God was at work even when they could not see it. His timing was shaping them, preparing them, and setting the stage for an event that would change the course of history. God knew that their deliverance wouldn't just be a simple exit from Egypt. It was going to be a powerful moment in His redemption plan for all of humanity. The Israelites needed to be prepared, and God's patience with them was part of His larger plan. This same principle applies to our lives today. We might be facing situations where we feel as though we've been waiting for years for a breakthrough, whether it's a job opportunity, healing from an illness, reconciliation in a relationship, or clarity in our purpose. We often ask, why is it taking so long? Why doesn't God act faster? But the truth is that we can't see the full picture as God sees it. He is not constrained by time, and His perspective is eternal. What seems like a delay to us may be a necessary step in the process of preparing us for something greater. We may not fully understand why we have to wait, but we can trust that God's timing is trusting in the process is an essential part of walking faithfully with God. In our world, we have grown accustomed to quick fixes and immediate results. If we don't see immediate fruit, we often question if we're doing something wrong or wonder why God isn't answering our prayers quickly. But the process of growing in faith, building character, and receiving God's promises is rarely instantaneous. It takes time, perseverance, and above all, trust. Trusting in the process is not passive, it's an active decision to surrender to God's ways and believe that even when we don't see the outcome, He is at work. In the book of James, we are told that the testing of your faith produces perseverance, James 1:03. This means that growth happens in the struggle, in the process. It's in the waiting, in the tension between our desires and God's timing, that our faith is refined. It's easy to have faith when everything is going smoothly, but the real growth comes when we trust God through the seasons of uncertainty, confusion, and delay. Think of the process of refining gold. Gold doesn't become pure simply by being found in the earth. It must be heated to extremely high temperatures so that the impurities can be separated from it. The process is long, hot, and often uncomfortable, but the result is something precious and valuable. So it is with our lives. We go through seasons where we feel like we're being tested, where everything feels difficult, and where the results aren't visible right away. But God is refining us. He is purifying our hearts, our motives, and our trust in Him. It's in the fire that we discover the strength and character that God is building within us. Trusting in the process also requires patience. Patience is not simply about waiting, it's about how we wait. It's easy to become impatient when we feel like things aren't happening on our timetable. We want immediate answers, immediate results, and immediate gratification. But God's ways are higher than ours, and His timing is always perfect. Psalm 27:14 tells us, "Wait for the Lord, be strong and take heart, and wait for the Lord." Waiting is not about doing nothing. It's about being strong in our faith while we wait, trusting that God is working even when we can't see it. Waiting with patience means trusting that the process is not pointless or without purpose. Consider the example of David in the Bible. God had anointed him to be king over Israel when he was a young shepherd boy. But after that moment of anointing, David's life took a very different path than he probably expected. Instead of moving into the palace and taking his rightful place on the throne, David spent years running from King Saul, living in caves. He could have easily become bitter, angry, and frustrated with God's process. He could have given up on the promise and taken matters into his own hands. But David trusted in the process. Even in the wilderness, he continued to seek God, to write psalms of praise, and to grow in his relationship with the Lord. When the time was right, God elevated him to the throne, and David became one of Israel's greatest kings. Now it turns out that God took water from the sand. His faithfulness during the process, during the waiting, was what prepared him for the position of leadership that God had promised him. There are times when we don't understand why things are happening the way they are. We may feel overlooked or underappreciated. We may see others moving ahead while we feel stuck. But the process is part of God. He's not just preparing us for what's to come. He's preparing us to be able to handle the blessings and responsibilities that He is entrusting to us. If we rush the process, we might miss important lessons that will shape our character and our ability to steward the things that God wants to give us. God is always working in the process, even when we don't feel like it. It's important to remember that trusting in the process doesn't mean there won't be challenges. There will be seasons of uncertainty, seasons when things feel dry, and seasons when we wonder if we've been forgotten. But it is in these seasons that our trust is built. Trust grows in the dark moments, in the moments when we can't see the next step, and we must lean on God's promises instead of our own understanding. We are not called to understand every detail of God's plan. Our role is to trust that He knows what's best. Proverbs 3:05-6 tells us, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to Him, and He will make your path straight." When we trust God with our whole heart, we acknowledge that His wisdom far surpasses ours. His plan for our lives is better than anything we could orchestrate for ourselves. It's easy to try to take control of the process when we feel unsure or anxious about the future. But true trust comes when we let go of our need for control and surrender our desires to God, knowing that He is leading us to something good. Trusting in the process also requires a perspective shift. When we focus only on the active, trust and faith are not just passive beliefs that we carry in our hearts, but they are active, daily decisions that we make. In a world where distractions and difficulties often tempt us to focus on the immediate and the visible, active trust in God means choosing to walk by faith, even when we don't see the immediate results. It means acknowledging that God's ways and timing are greater than our own, and that we can rely on Him in every circumstance. Trusting in God actively requires us to rely on His strength rather than our own understanding, to step out in faith even when the path is uncertain, and to hold fast to His promises when the world around us seems shaky. Faith is described in Hebrews 11:01 as the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. This is not a faith that simply sits idle. This is a faith that acts, that moves, that believes in the unseen, and waits expectantly for what God will bring to pass. Our faith is not meant to be a passive state of waiting around for something to happen. It's meant to be a living, breathing force that shapes the decisions we make, the way we view the world, and the actions we take. The Bible is filled with examples of active trust and faith, times when men and women stepped out boldly, trusting in God's promises and following His lead, even when they didn't know exactly where the journey would lead. One of the clearest examples of active faith is found in the story of Abraham. When God called Abraham to leave his homeland and go to a place he had never seen, Abraham didn't hesitate. He didn't wait for all the details to be spelled out. He didn't ask for a roadmap or a timeline. He simply trusted God and took that first step of obedience. Abraham didn't know the exact destination, but he believed that God was faithful, and he took God at His word. In Hebrews 11:8 it says, "By faith Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed, and went, even though he did not know where he was going." Abraham's faith was active. He didn't wait for a clearer picture or a more comfortable situation. He simply obeyed, trusting that God knew where He was leading. Active trust in God also means taking God's promises seriously, even when the circumstances around us seem to contradict those promises. In the life of Joseph, we see how God's promise to him as a young man was not immediately fulfilled. Joseph had dreams of greatness, but those dreams seemed to lead him on a path that included betrayal by his brothers, slavery, and imprisonment. Yet throughout this journey, Joseph never stopped trusting in God. In fact, when he was finally in a position of power in Egypt, God's plan is unfolding in our lives, often in ways that we don't understand at the moment. It's easy to get caught up in the present circumstances, to focus solely on what's happening right now, and to forget that God is working behind the scenes in ways we can't always see. Sometimes we're so caught up in the here and now that we miss the bigger picture, the picture of how God is orchestrating every detail of our lives for His purpose and glory. But even when things seem unclear or difficult, even when life feels uncertain, we can trust that God's plan is unfolding and that He is guiding us step by step toward His ultimate purpose for our lives. From the very beginning of creation, God has had a plan. He created the heavens and the earth and everything in it with intentionality and purpose. Every season, every moment, and every part of the unfolding story of the world fits into His perfect plan. And that plan is not just for the world at large, it is for each of us individually. God is intimately involved in the details of our lives. He is not a distant, uninvolved deity who set the world in motion and then walked away. He is present with us every day, guiding, shaping, and directing our paths. The challenge comes when we don't see the plan clearly, when things don't make sense, or when life takes unexpected turns. It's easy to lose sight of God's plan when we're faced with disappointment, confusion, or pain, but even in those moments, we can have confidence that God is still at work. His plan for our lives is unfolding, even if we don't always understand the path we are on. His word assures us in Jeremiah 29:11, "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans for welfare and not for evil, to give you a future and a hope." Even when we don't see it, God's plan is good, and it is leading us to a future filled with hope. Think about the story of Joseph in the Bible. Joseph's life was full of unexpected twists and turns, and for many years it seemed as though his dreams of greatness would never come to pass. Betrayed by his brothers, sold into slavery, falsely accused, and thrown into prison. Joseph's life was filled with hardship and disappointment, but all along, God was working behind the scenes. Each seemingly tragic event was part of a larger plan. When Joseph was finally reunited with his brothers years later, he could look back and say, "You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good." Joseph's story is a reminder that, even in the darkest moments, God is still at work. His plan was unfolding, and what looked like a series of setbacks was actually God's way of positioning Joseph exactly where he needed to be to save many lives during a time of famine. God's plan often unfolds in ways that we don't expect or understand at the moment. We can't always see the end result from where we stand, but just because we don't understand the path doesn't mean God's plan isn't being worked out. God's perspective is eternal, and He sees the end from the beginning. We, on the other hand, often live in the moment and can only see the pieces that are right in front of us. But God sees the whole picture, and He knows how every piece fits together. Trusting in God's plan requires faith in His wisdom and understanding. We don't need to know everything in advance. We simply need to trust that God knows what He's doing. Take, for instance, the story of Moses. Moses was raised in Pharaoh's palace, but God had a different plan for his life. Moses fled Egypt after killing an Egyptian, and for 40 years he lived as a shepherd in the wilderness. During those years, Moses may have wondered if God had forgotten him, or if his life would ever have any significance. But when God appeared to him in the burning bush, He revealed His plan. Moses was to return to Egypt and lead the Israelites out of slavery. Moses' life had been preparing him for that moment in ways he couldn't have anticipated. His time in the wilderness was part of the process that shaped him into the leader he needed to be. God's plan was unfolding step by step even when Moses couldn't see it. This is often how God works in our lives. We may not always understand why we're going through a particular season or why things are happening the way they are, but we can trust that God is preparing us for what's to come. Every experience, every struggle, and every triumph is part of God's larger plan for us. We may not see it right now, but we can rest assured that God is using every detail of our lives for His purpose. There are times when we are in the midst of waiting, wondering when God's plan will become clear or when things will finally start to fall into place. It can feel like we're stuck, like nothing is happening, and like we're just spinning our wheels. But waiting is often a crucial part of the process. The Bible tells us that God's ways are not our ways, and His timing is perfect. There is purpose in the waiting, even when it feels uncomfortable or frustrating. God is working in us during the waiting season. He is refining our character, building our trust in Him, and preparing us for what's ahead. Just as a seed takes time to grow into a plant, God's plan in our lives takes time to unfold. We may not understand all of the steps along the way, but we can trust that God knows exactly what He's doing. One of the most important things we can do as we wait for God's plan to unfold is to stay close to Him, to keep our hearts aligned with His will, and to trust in His promises. The psalmist reminds us in Psalm 37:4 and 5, "Delight yourself in the Lord, and He will give you the desires of your heart. Commit your way to the Lord. Trust in Him, and He will act." As we trust in God and commit ourselves to His ways, we can be confident that He will lead us on the right path. We may not know what lies ahead, but we can trust that God's plan is always good, always perfect, and always for our ultimate good. God's plan is unfolding even when it seems like nothing is happening. There is a season for everything, and each season is a necessary part of the process. When things seem slow or unclear, remember that God is working behind the scenes. When the road ahead seems uncertain, remember that God is directing your steps. And when life feels like it's not moving forward, remember that God's plan is unfolding, step by step, in ways you may not yet see. Trust in His timing and trust that He is always at work, even when we can't see the whole picture.